everyone, welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today it is my distinct pleasure to have with us today host extraordinaire of Poetic Lines, Miss Elizabeth Lund. Elizabeth, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much, Becky. I'm delighted to be here. You do a wonderful job.
Well, thank you. And in addition to Poetic Lines, Elizabeth wears many hats. She's a poet, a writer, definitely an interviewer. She has been a poetry editor and led workshops. She's done so many things, even been a judge at a poetry contest. That's pretty cool. So, Elizabeth, with all of that, how did you get involved in writing? Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, I'd be happy to tell you. Like many people, I started writing poetry when I was a teenager, and my family was going through some real challenges. My parents were getting divorced, my grandmother was dying. There was just a lot of uncertainty that I didn't quite know how to handle. And I started putting my feelings down on paper. When I did that, it gave me the ability to kind of change what I was experiencing, to reshape it a bit. And once I did have my feelings down on the page, I could then push the page away from me and feel a bit of freedom. So I guess it started out almost as catharsis, but the more I wrote, the more I started to share my work with teachers and some trusted adults who said, "You really have a talent. I love this. It's beautiful." Or, "I love the humor here. Keep writing." And that's when I started shifting from poetry just as self-expression or trying to figure things out to poetry as a craft. And what did that mean? And I started to also think about my audience a bit.
And as you have grown in your writing, how has your writing style changed?
I think when I started, I used almost very jagged lines and very tight imagery and very emotionally charged language. And to some extent, I still do that, but I have learned to expand all of those tools and to use them in different ways. Poets have a tool belt. There are many tools in your belt, and over time, I think you use the same tools over and over, but you use them in new ways. You're always looking for a new way to express things because you're always experiencing new things in life. And you're always looking for new ways to discover another aspect of poetry. A few years ago, I interviewed Joy Harjo, and she made the wonderful statement that poetry is broad enough and deep enough to encompass all of human experience. And she's right. So as a writer, I'm always trying to dig deeper into that experience and find new ways to capture it.
One of the things that it says in your bio is that you've always loved how poetry transforms my perception of the world by first transforming how I experience language. Can you elaborate on that?
We all use language every day, and many of us write. We write business memos. We may write news stories. We may write papers for a college course. We're always writing, and much of the time, we use language to convey ideas, to convey facts, to convey things that we need to do, initiatives. Poetry uses language in a very different way. It uses imagery, it uses metaphor, it uses sound. And poetry is condensed. So where a business memo might be condensed, poetry is condensed, but it gives you a very full experience. It puts you into the experience. It lets you see it, taste it sometimes, hear it, feel it. That's one of the things that makes poetry so powerful. When you go into a poem, it changes the way you see things. And when you come out of that poem, you're going to keep what the poem showed you for hours, in some cases, maybe months or years.
That was a beautiful answer. One of the things that you have written is a collection of poetry called Unsilenced, which is published by Cervena Barba Press. Can you discuss what impact that you wish this very important topic, what do you wish that impact to be on your readers?
Well, let me start by saying that I never planned to write about the topic of domestic violence. This book was not something I wanted to write. In fact, I resisted writing it for months. The poems were sparked by the death of my beloved Aunt Elaine in 2011. She was shot and killed by her husband of 40 plus years. That experience was devastating. It was shocking, and I think everyone in my family was just horrified and just bereft. We were left with questions. Why did he do it? Why did she stay? And for me, one haunting question was there anything I could have done or said to help prevent that? So for a while, I didn't write about the experience because I didn't want to look as though I was taking advantage of something or sensationalizing a horrible tragedy. But after a few months went by, I needed to do something with the emotion. So I wrote one poem and I felt better. And then a few months went by and I wrote another poem and I felt better for a little while. And then over time, a whole series of poems came out. And I thought, is there something here? I started to look at how the poems were talking to each other and how they were talking to me. So as I looked at that and considered the whole question of what happened, I started to notice that there were three distinct sections arising. The first dealt with my aunt's experience, what little we knew, because she didn't talk much about her experience. And that's the case with many victims of domestic violence. The second section dealt with the experiences of women I had worked with at the women's prison here in Massachusetts. Almost all of them had experienced domestic violence and also the violence of an abusive father. The third section of poems was the speaker trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out, how do I get through this? How do I find some tiny thread of light or redemption in this? Because when someone is murdered, you can't bring the person back. But is there something that you can do or say to honor that person's legacy or to shine a light on what that person meant to you? So as I said, I never planned to write those poems. But once the book was published, I started to hear from people, often older women, who said, "Oh, thank you for writing those poems. I see so much of myself in that book. Thank you for having the courage to say what no one else will say." And I guess that's what I hope to hear from readers, that they see something in the poems that make them question their own experience and make them wonder if they can start to think beyond their current circumstances. Can they be unsilenced? Can they start to think beyond what's limiting them now?
It sounds like that this book has had a major impact on you and maybe your healing.
Yes, definitely, because as I'm describing the book now, I can still feel some of the emotions I felt after my aunt was killed. It's something that will always be with me, but I feel that I have crafted something that may be able to help other women in their own journey toward freedom and toward understanding that they have value. They don't have to stay trapped. They don't have to be silenced. 1 out of 4 women in the United States will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. And one of the poems in the book is my reflecting on an experience I had when I was in graduate school. I was engaged to someone who initially seemed very charming, very charismatic. But once I had a ring on my finger, the relationship changed. He became controlling. He wanted to know where I was at every moment. We lived 500 miles apart at that point. He wanted to have approval over who I spent time with. And I started to feel my life becoming very small. And people said that they could tell when he was in the room or when I had been talking to him on the phone because my behavior changed. So I made the difficult decision to leave, and it wasn't easy, but I'm so glad I did because I would not have the life I have now if I had stayed.
You were a poetry editor for Christian Science Monitor for 10 years and had a monthly column in the Washington Post. How have these experiences affected or changed your worldview?
I don't know that they've changed my worldview, but they have certainly reinforced my belief that poetry is needed. It is needed in a variety of ways. Most of what people see in a newspaper are stories that talk about the issues of the day.
Hmm.
They're looking at policies, they're looking at a lot of data, a lot of facts. And those stories may have anecdotes, they may have descriptions of people and how people are affected by certain issues, but it's not the same as reading a poem. And so, what I found when I was editing poetry for the Monitor and then writing about it for the Post is that people really liked having poetry to balance what they see in the news. Poems are often a breath of fresh air. They allow you to look at things through a different lens, they allow you to breathe and to experience language and life in a different way than you do if you're just reading a news story or watching a news program on TV.
Has there been anyone's work that stood out to you as just life changing when you saw it?
I think when I was in my 20s, I really was impacted by the work of Jane Kenyon. And I love the work of Mary Oliver because both those women, they write so beautifully about the natural world. And that resonated with me because of where I grew up and the way that they used imagery. It was just so powerful. I think I have always strived to do that in my work because I want people to be transported to a different setting, to a different moment, to a different feeling. I learned something from almost every poet that I read, and certainly every poet that I interview.
Well, and speaking of interviewing, you host a program called Poetic Lines, which is where writers make the language sing. Tell us about how Poetic Lines came about and how do you curate your questions for the interviews?
Well, the show started several years ago at a TV station in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. That station had a monthly show featuring poets and musicians, and the host of that show asked me to interview some of the poets who had appeared on that show as a National Poetry Month special. The interviews were met with such interest that the station invited me to do a regular show. I love talking to poets. I love finding out what makes them tick. How do they start a poem? Is it with an image, a line, or an idea? I love hearing about their creativity and also their path in life because poets, many of them go the academic route, many others do not. So, how does that influence their work? And how does their work influence what they do in all aspects of their lives? The question of how do you curate? Because I think sometimes people come to me and they offer to do an interview. Other times I see someone's work that I really admire and I'll reach out to that person. But whichever way the thought comes, I'm interested in looking at the person's work. I want to get a sense of what the writing is like. Then I also want to know, what is the person's story? Because every episode of Poetic Lines, I think, adds to a larger conversation about poetry. Everyone has something that they are adding to the larger body of work, and as Joy Harjo said, to the incredible depth and breadth that poetry can hold.
Well, is there any particular person that you've interviewed that you would like to have return?
Well, I just finished interviewing James Cruz for the second time, and he is wonderful. He has edited 3 best-selling anthologies of poetry. He's written wonderful books himself, and he always talks about gratitude and about slowing down and
Mm.
inhabiting the moment and looking for ways that we can move forward in a positive way. And that's not always easy, given many of the things going on in the world, but he is just wonderful. And when I talk to him, we have a wonderful conversation, and I always think, oh, I can't wait to share this. So that interview will be coming up very soon.
Well, Elizabeth, tell us about what advice, since you have worked with so many writers on so many different aspects and levels, what advice would you give them that perhaps you follow yourself when it comes to writing?
Probably the most important piece of advice is to focus on the quality of your work. Focus on developing your voice before you start thinking about how you're going to market. There is so much emphasis these days and so much pressure for people to develop a big following online, to develop your own platform. And that's important, certainly once you have a book or more out. But in the early stages, it's really important to figure out what your voice needs to sound like, what your poems are wanting to say through you. Because when you do that, when you focus on quality, the opportunities come. And I've certainly had that experience in my own life. I also know from experience that you may want to publish when you're in your 20s. You may want to accomplish everything right away. It doesn't always go that way. So if someone is in their 20s and hasn't published a book yet, that's okay. You've got plenty of time. If someone is in your 30s and you haven't published a book yet, that's okay. You have plenty of time. Just keep writing, keep developing as a writer, and it will come.
Do you belong to any critique groups or any writing groups, Elizabeth?
I have a handful of writer friends who read everything that I write, and I depend on them because they're excellent readers and they're good friends. So they'll tell me that, this section isn't really working. As one of my blunter friends recently told me, did you have too much caffeine before you wrote this? Yeah, this doesn't work at all. But I depend on that because they know what my writing is like and what it can sound like. And they know when things are off. I'd much rather hear ahead of time that something isn't working than to send it out and have an editor say, this just doesn't get there, or worse yet, to publish something and then realize later that that's not as good as it could have been.
Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about what you would like for people to know about you.
That's a great question. I think what would be helpful for people to know is to hear a little bit about my childhood experience because I grew up in southern New Hampshire in the city of Nashua, but my family lived on the last street in Nashua. So the front yard looked out on this wonderful dead-end neighborhood with about 12 different families. Everybody knew each other. All the parents looked out for everyone else's kids. There was a wonderful woman across the street who became sort of a second mom to me. And she was always very encouraging. We are still close to this day. She has always been a big believer in my writing. The backyard looked out on Hollis, New Hampshire. That's farm community. So behind our house, there were miles of woods and fields where you could walk for hours and just look at the trees, look at the birds. And it was just wonderful. I think the dichotomy of that, having nature in the backyard and a community in the front yard, definitely has influenced my writing because I often draw on images from nature. But I'm also interested in people and their stories. And I think those two influences appear in my writing, but they also influence everything I do, from editing to interviewing, and even when I try to nurture young writers. That dichotomy is always there. And I think it's a big part of what makes my writing unique.
Do you ever face any challenges in your writing?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I work full time and I am a board member of the New England Poetry Club, which means that I produce their e-newsletter every month. I am a co-director of Haiku Newton, which keeps me busy from January through the summer. I have a monthly show and I got married
Oh, well,
5 years ago.
congratulations on that.
Thank you. So, yes, I have a very busy life, as do many of us. And I think the biggest challenge for me is just carving out time to write. And it's not just finding the hours to do it, but finding the mental space to do it, clearing the busyness of the world, and letting the poem guide you. Part of the creative process for me is starting with an image or a few lines and seeing how far I can shape that, but also listening, active listening for what the poem wants to tell me. Poems will lead you, and that's when the best work comes, I think.
Does it ever surprise you as to where it goes?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, if there isn't a surprise in a poem, it's usually not one of my best. And that's when I know I have to get myself out of the way and figure out what is there to be discovered. What do I need to nudge a little bit more? What do I need to explore?
Elizabeth, will you read some of your work for us?
I want to start with the opening poem from my book, Unsilenced. It's called Remembering Elaine. One great blue heron punctuates the shore, huddling in first snow. What keeps this steel-eyed juvenile here, weeks after the others have flown? Gray on gray, she stands like a wrought iron question mark. What does she read in the tinfoil sky? Its indecipherable script. Does she stand, like me, awaiting a sign? Has she hunkered too far down? How do winged creatures lose their lift, their bold exclamation point? One could say the sky turns a deaf ear, that some stories are meant to trail off. She stands ramrod straight, like a stubborn suicide or a righteous sacrifice. But I'm not ready to let her go as the season's first storm spits and swirls.
Beautiful.
So I'll read another poem from the first section of the book. And this highlights some of my aunt's wonderful qualities. The fittest. Animals respond to a gentle voice, she'd say as one shook on her lap. Figaro, Daisy, Magic. She coaxed and captured them all. Princess, Blackie, Snowball, saved from the side of the road. One tiger followed her everywhere, a shadow leaving the room. Another hid under the sofa until she was all alone. Love them until they can rule the savannah, always a gentle voice. Elaine, lost queen of the jungle, you should have roared or run. So I mentioned that I was a volunteer at the women's prison for 10 years, and it was always amazing to me to see the raw creativity, the raw talent, and the raw intelligence of those women, but also to see how many of them had really been traumatized by different experiences. And so many were imprisoned mentally long before they ever got to the prison. This poem deals with some of that. Interrogation. For 3 weeks in March, a barred owl kept watch from a beech tree inside the barbed wire fence. Who comes for you? It asked every night of the women trapped in their prison blues. The question echoed across the empty yard. Who comes for you, or you, or you? Perhaps the bird divined lonely passings, or knew how lovers, friends, and children rarely visit. Who comes for you, or remembers your name? The owl repeated until every brown leaf, still clinging from last season, shriveled and fell from the oak tree like an unspoken confession. What's interesting about the owl that appeared in that poem
Mhm.
is that it sparked owls to appear in other poems. And that solves a big problem because as I was putting the collection together, it felt like the three sections didn't quite work. There was not a thread that linked them. But after I wrote that poem, owls started appearing elsewhere, and they became the thematic thread I needed because they could say things that the humans couldn't see or didn't want to admit. But that's a good example of letting the poem lead you, letting the owl show up, and then following that owl wherever it wants to go.
And from what I hear, owls are pretty wise. So
They are, yes,
best to
they
follow
are.
them.
Yes, and so since these poems have been published, people have started giving me owls. So if you were able to see around my apartment, you would see owls everywhere, stuffed owls, wooden owls, owls in snow globes everywhere. And I love that because it's a constant reminder to let the poem speak to you. So, as I said, many of the women at the prison had experienced domestic violence. And so the book includes some of their stories. And this poem captures a moment that I heard when I was there. Maria's Mirage. No one understands why I stay. He just needs a little more love. Red bites, yellow bruises, blue lights slicing the sky. He was never treated right. Mother, father, friends, purple eyelids, scarlet scars. Is that blood on the door? Pay no mind. I tripped and fell. He just needs a little more love. Other women shift in their seats. Sister, why can't you open your eyes? This next poem is sort of the turn in the book. And this is when the speaker has worked through her grief and is now trying to make sense of things and to look at the experience in a new way by looking back to how she used to experience things as a child. Underwater. The challenge was easy then. Dive off the boat at high tide, swim down, down till you touch the white sand, then translate the messages signaled from above. I remember sitting on the bottom, watching the greenish sun wobble or trade one shape for another until the sky became a watercolor map only my cousin and I could decipher. Each wave made the thin paint shimmer, another wash of light rippling across the canvas. Nothing looked the way it should, and sounds like poorly aimed arrows deflected off the surface. Yet when she leaned over the side of the boat, arms waving like seaweed, I knew what she meant. Stay there. Go this way. I'm the queen. We didn't need words, not when an invisible chain ran from boat to sand, a family secret that flowed through our veins, an ancient script tattooed on our fingers long before we were born. Soon enough, my lungs would burn, and I'd kick toward the surface, reclaiming the world of sound. Salt never stung, as I recall, until I broke through the swells. The sky is mine. I own the sun. Hold your breath, hold it. We understood metaphor then.
I really like the fact that you have healing in your book, that, especially the hope of being able to get through and claim that you own the sun.
Well, I think I have always tended to be an optimist. And part of that is because of the relationship I had with the woman who lived across the street from me when I was growing up. She was relentlessly optimistic. She always encouraged people. She always looked for the best in people. And she had a profound effect on the way I see things and on the way I try to be now as an adult. But I think in addition to that, when you go through a devastating experience, if you don't find a way to transform it, at least a little bit, it can become something that is a stumbling block in your life. And if you have no control at all, then that's, I think, when people really struggle, because how do you get past something that you cannot fix? But if you can change the way you look at it, if you can reclaim it in some small way, that does give you the power to live with it and move past it. I don't think we were meant to carry our scars unless we are able to shift our perspective a bit. If you shift your perspective, that changes everything. And I'll give you just a mild example. This morning when I got up, I went outside because it snowed last night. So we had several inches of snow on the ground. Snow changes everything. It changes the landscape, much as poetry changes the way we see the world. So I went outside and I noticed, oh, there were some paw prints on the stairs. And I thought, are those from a cat or are those from one of the rabbits that typically have gone into their dens at this point? I normally wouldn't be thinking about the cats in the neighborhood or the rabbits. Then I noticed that one of my neighbors had shoveled part of my walkway. And I looked over and could see the neighbor. And this area, people oftentimes don't know their neighbors or don't see them very often. But because of the path being shoveled, I did notice that person. And then I turned to the right and I noticed that my other neighbor had shoveled part of my path or had taken a leaf blower and blown away the snow. All of that was a wonderful reminder to me that so often I just bound down the steps. I don't notice any details like that. But when I do stop and I see those details, it makes my experience much richer. Poetry is like that snow because it does change the way you experience things. And as I said earlier, you can take that experience and that perception change for hours, weeks, and if you find a poem you really love, it can stay with you for years. But that experience reminded me that sometimes just being in the moment, being fully present, that is the best way to help not only yourself, but others.
Well, Elizabeth, where can we find your work?
That's a good question. So if people are interested in looking at my print interviews or looking at a lot of my video interviews, the best place to do that is by going to my website, which I will be updating in the next few days. If you're interested in the book, you can go to Amazon.com and find it there. And I hope to have a YouTube channel up in the next few weeks. Sometimes I focus too much on just the content, and this year one of my resolutions is to be better at promoting. But my goal in everything I do is to help people discover the creativity in them, help them discover insights and talents they might not have discovered yet, and just show them how poetry can enhance your life, no matter what your experience is or how much or little experience you've had with poetry. It really can be something that is a blessing to you.
Elizabeth, you are such a joy, and I thank you so much for taking the time to be with us at Briar Haus Writes today. I wish you all the best in your future.
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed this immensely. I admire the work you're doing. You have a fantastic show. Thank you for a wonderful experience. And I am so happy to have been part of this.
Well, we're happy to have you.